Everyone have a chance to take a look? Any comments?
I move to approve.
Have a second?
Support.
Support, okay, all right. All in favor of approving the minutes?
Aye.
Aye. All right, good, thank you for producing those, Liz. Comments. Are you a member of the public who would like to comment?
So I'm actually here in support of Jessica to talk about the budget. So my name is Rod Taylor and I'm from a company called Manor Casterison, and we've been helping the township with the budget. So a part of the budget conversation.
Okay, you'll be on in just a little bit then.
Yep, thank you.
Jessica, are there people online who want to comment, you know?
We got a couple people, Kathleen Brandt or John Reiser, just kidding. Kathleen Brandt and Rob Pattinston. Rob, please go ahead.
Rob? Yes. Could you be quickly responsive to that?
Sure. Rob, can you hear me okay?
It's Barry. Rob?
Okay. We were of the impression that there was no place to install a parking lot on that property, either on Huron River Drive or on Joy Road. We were previously told that there was not adequate sight lines on the Joy Road frontage, and the Huron River Drive frontage has really steep slopes. And would have to, a lot of gravel would have to be removed, so we want to do that. And so we wanted to buy that piece of ground from Wisely and Fix, because we were told that piece did have sufficient sight lines to put in a driveway and a parking area there. We later learned that the reverse was true, that property did not have adequate sight lines, and there was adequate sight lines on the preserve. So we didn't need to buy that property. And so we just, the purchase agreement actually had expired for that, and the sellers weren't cooperating, and because we didn't need the property anymore, we just decided to walk away from it. It's not anything of any significance. It's, you know, an old field. It would have been a nice little addition to the preserve, but nothing of any significance on it. And there will be a parking area located on Joy Road for the public to access the preserve. You're welcome, sir.
Good to hear from you, Rob. Kathleen, did you have anything to say?
She doesn't have her hand up.
Okay. All right, then.
Will, did we approve both the agenda and the minutes? Or did we just? I think
we need to approve the minutes. Maybe.
We need to approve the agenda, I think.
Yes.
I would move the agenda with the exception of moving the budget and finance discussion up as soon as we can hear it.
I got you. Okay, that's great. And then a second?
Second.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you for clarifying that. All right, so as per the suggested change to the order of the agenda, we would like to have a discussion of our budget and finances regarding certain matters that have not been clear as to how things are accounted for and how we may be out of compliance with state regulations. Is that the way we might describe this?
That's a little harsh, but yeah.
Well, bring us the good news then.
Okay. Well, it's the township and your board that's out of compliance, not the LPC.
Oh, okay, you guys.
That's the
Come on,
first
get your
thing I
act
want
together,
to be clear. Thanks, Mark, for being here. And I just wanted to hand these out just some documents I'll be referencing. And what I'd like to do first is very briefly just kind of go over the issues we've had that have been related to the open space fund, and then turn it over to Rob so that you all can talk to him about the proposed budget. Okay, so we're really gonna go kind of about finance. We're gonna talk about finances first and then proposed budget. So the reason I wanted to come to speak with you all today is because, as you know, the township's trying to make improvements to our financial accounting, trying to hire a finance director. We're really happy to have Manor Casterison here helping in the interim, bringing us into compliance. We have an annual audit every year. Our fiscal year end is March 31st, as you know, so the most recently completed one was fiscal year end 22. We had several findings from that audit, and one of the findings is described here on this first page. So in response to the findings, we're required to submit what's called the corrective action plan to the state. So one of our issues, or deficiencies, as they said, was that actual expenditures exceeded the amount authorized in the budget. Please describe the actions being taken to prevent budget variances. So there was a small overage in the general fund, and there was a rather large one in the open space fund. Over $300,000. We were over in the open space. And the year before that, we were over by a few hundred in the open space fund. And so that falls on the township board to be more diligent about appropriating funds before expending them. So it's not that the cash wasn't actually there, it's that we hadn't properly budgeted for them prior to expending them. And so because this is one of our major funds, and there's large purchases, I think you've had what, like $4 or $5 million worth of activity the last 2 years. You're doing bigger purchases. We need to get in a better habit of making sure that when you have a property coming forth, I would ask that any potential action coming to the board, please bring it through either Mark Thompson, the manager, or me, the clerk, so that we can go through, check all the records, make sure that it's properly prepared for the board before it's presented. And I know a lot of times, you know, there's opportunities and things, it won't take long. It's just a matter that we have to properly budget for these.
And you're looking for what when we bring you something? What are the sort of bullet points that you need to examine?
Just time, a day. I mean, just time, because I think it's, you know, sometimes we have items coming forth, like, and I don't know exactly, Barry, there was a transfer made for the Loveland property of over $300,000 right at the end of our fiscal year. Okay, so March 29th, that's 2 days before the end of our fiscal year. So it's just one of those quirky things where we'd probably already done year-end budget amendments. And it wasn't enough. And it wasn't enough, okay? And so what would be really helpful is, I mean, number one, here we are, what are we on, March 9th? So in the next 22 days, are there any big expenditures that we don't know about, just given the nature of things, Barry? But also, when items come to the board, Barry does a great job of bringing kind of summary of the project, the history of it all, but it needs to go through either the manager or the clerk so that we can make sure we have funds properly appropriated for it. And that's just a second action that the board would take at that meeting. So it wouldn't slow anything down, provided that you have the fund balance for it. It would just help us keep our accounting better. Does that make sense? Pretty simple. Yeah, please, Margaret.
In response to the question, you asked what is it that we would need?
Yeah, please.
And you mentioned time, we need a dollar amount as well.
Certainly, yes.
And itemized
We usually get that.
itemized dollar amounts?
No, just a dollar amount. I think that, and it is it's not any more complex than what I'm asking, Will. It is just a dollar amount and a day so that we can verify that we have the money and properly prepare the action for the board. So it's not just, and I think it's also, you know, sort of the learning that the entire township's going through, where we were too accustomed to authorizing and then just amending the budget at the end of the year, right?
Can I
Please.
jump in on best practice? So interesting enough, you talked about the corrective action plan. I actually used to work for the state of Michigan, and so I was the one that you sent corrective action plans to. There's a public act called PA2 of 1968, which basically defines that a local unit of government can't spend more money than what they've appropriated. So the concept is that if you set a budget at the beginning of the year, and you can spend money out of that budget throughout the entire year until a point which you don't have enough money budgeted. So let's say, and you guys have your land easement fund, you guys appropriated $1 million, but you have a project that's gonna come in at $1.2 million. Best practice would be before that contract was approved, you would go back to the board and say, we originally appropriated $1 million. I'm asking for an appropriation of $1.2 million. Can you increase it by $200,000? The board would then take action, and then that would then be appropriated, and then you would proceed with the project. Now, many local units of government do exactly what Jessica says, which is they don't monitor that. They wait to the end of the year, and then they make the adjustments. And the reason that's bad practice is because you're not managing your finances. If you don't know where you're at any point in time, how can you adequately manage your financial position? So my suggestion would be two things, if you don't mind. One would be if you're doing a big project that's going to go over the budget, you bring it to the board. The other thing would be it probably would be a best practice for this board to get a budget to actual report. How often do you guys meet? Is it monthly? I mean, at least once a quarter. And that would be something that Jessica could provide. And then that way that you guys are just aware where you're at financially as well. And then you could bring to light to the board if there's anything that you guys have noticed as well that needs to be brought up.
Right.
So.
And I think that's great, Rod. And that is a best practice. You know, you mentioned the line item. I'll be so bold to say even a minimum practice, if we're not going to do the best, is we budget this fund, the fund as a whole. So if we're going to go over the fund that's been budgeted and line items are different, that's okay for now. But within the fund, you're going to go over, we need to know that. And that's why I brought the balance sheet and the revenue expenditure report for Fund 242, which is the special revenue fund that contains all of the open space activities. So, you know, as it's important to make sure that you're, you know, comfortable enough, you know, looking at these. We present these monthly to the board. Happy to talk about them. I know Barry's probably a little more familiar with them, but it's really important that we're all working from the same set of data, which are these township financial records.
So we don't do the budget, the board does the budget, but we have our own budget and know where we are in our own fund 242, right? So where are we right now for 2023 ending in 21 days? Do we need to let you know so that the board can adjust our budget before the end of the fiscal year on Tuesday?
You've got that right here. So second page, and it's the revenue and expenditure report for 3/31/23. And you'll see the column is the original budget. The amended budget includes any amendments made to date and the year-to-date balance. Sure. It says revenue and expenditure report period ending 3/31/23.
Right. Okay.
Yep. And so this is the fund, the first column, original budget, is everything that we adopted on April 1st of 22.
Okay.
The 22-23 amended budget is really the current budget. So any budget amendments that have been made, you'll see we've made 0 budget amendments this year, which is fine.
So we need to do one on Tuesday so we get it done before the end of the fiscal year, is that correct?
So you don't need, I'll leave that to Rod, but you can see for yourself, John, on the year-to-date balance there. you'll see that you are, in fact, well, no, your expenditures are over your revenue. And so you do need to do a budget amendment there to
Okay.
align that. When we adopted it, you can see it's okay to adopt a budget where expenditures are over revenues. You guys adopted, the board adopted a budget that was nearly $1 million over.
So like, as a board member, do I need to bring forward a resolution that I can talk to you offline about that would have us do that?
So go for it, Rod.
Good transition. So, again,
No.
my name's, again, Rod Taylor, and so the board has brought our firm on to assist the township on a number of financial matters. One of those, and can I actually steal one of those back?
Here, I got some for you.
No, you have to know by heart. Sorry.
So it's
Maynard
called
Casterison.
Maynard Casterison, just call it Maynard, it's easier to say. And so we're primarily an accounting CPA firm,
Okay.
but I actually have 27 years of experience working in local units of government. And so my focus is just local units of government and assisting them with best practices, good governance, operation types of activities. And so our firm has been brought in, as I said, to work on a number of things to assist the township. One is to help get over the hurdle of the budget. As Jessica said, the fiscal year ends this month. And under state law, the board must adopt a budget at the end of the fiscal year, or before the end of the fiscal year, to be able to operate starting April 1st. And so what I've been doing behind the scenes is taking the financial information the township has and doing really two things. One is trying to do estimates for the current fiscal year. So for the current fiscal year is 2023. And trying to figure out where the township is going to end up at the end of the fiscal year. And that's important for two reasons. One is important because we need to make sure that we're not over budget. So we need to do any budget adjustments. And I'll come back and answer your question in a second. And the second reason is that we need to know where we're at the end of 23, because that's going to impact what you might potentially do in 2024. So you need to know your financial state before you start planning for the next year. And so the document that you have before you is the land preservation budget. So the top section is your revenues. As you're aware, the majority of revenues are coming in from the taxation, the millage from, and then the bottom half is the expenditures. And then what we've done is the first two columns provide you some historical information. So that's your fiscal year ending 19. Actually, I printed this column wrong. I just noticed it. I hit this wrong. So that should actually be 21 and 22. So I'll need to correct that.
Which column, sir?
So that's the first two columns on the left-hand side. So you start with the account number, then you have the name of the account, and then the next two columns are supposed to be historical information.
So like 2021 instead of?
Yeah, it should be 21 and 22. But I've got 18, 19, and then 21, 22. And the reason the numbers are kind of funny, just so it says 21, 22 actual, because the fiscal year ends in 22, but the majority of it is in calendar year 21. So that's a lot of times you see it displayed as 21-22 because it's over 2 calendar years, but we refer to it as the 22 fiscal year. Parts of 2 years. Whatever it ends at, right? Okay. So the next column is the amended amount, and that's, as Jessica was saying, that's what we show as what has been approved by the board to date in terms of your budget. So theoretically, that's the amount that you can't go over. The next column is your actuals, and this actual is as of 2/17/23. So that's what we're showing in the general ledger that you've spent money on. The next column is the budget, the projected. And so that's a column that's looking at what has already happened today, as well as looking at some of the historical information. We're coming up with a projection of what you're going to end up at the end of the year. And where that becomes important, because that's the number that you want to compare back with your budget. And if that number is greater than what you have budgeted, then you need to do it in a budget adjustment. And so the process that the board will be undertaking is that I've already provided them with a draft set for all the accounts. A budget amendment. So to your question, and we'll talk about this today, we need to do any other updates. We have time to update this. But I provided them a draft of what some of those budget adjustments for all their funds need to be. And they most likely will take that up at their meeting on Tuesday. And that will allow them to put that in the system. And then it also allows them, because we still have 3 weeks after that, to see if any more bills come in or anything else changes at the last minute, so that if they need to, they could do a second set of budget adjustments on the 28th, the last week of the month. And the reason that's important is because sometimes we'll get a bill 30 days or 45 days from now. But you can't do a budget adjustment after the end of the fiscal year. So that's why you have to kind of guess. And so, for example, what I've recommended to the board is that we would do a budget adjustment in the amount of $709,000. And that amount would bring your amended budget to $2,300,000 approximately. Which may be a little bit low, but the idea being is that normally you give yourself a little bit of a cushion, because it's okay to be over, it's not okay to be under. And the reason it's not okay to be under is because if you're under, then you get a letter from the state of Michigan that says you need to do a corrective action plan. And so we try to have a little bit of cushion in there and just kind of speculate and have a little bit, a larger budget adjustment, if you will. So that explains the budget adjustment process, and that kind of finishes out 23.
The recommendation here to the last column, is that yours?
So, yes, so let's talk about the last two columns, okay? So the last two columns are what the board would adopt in their budget coming up in 2024, so the next fiscal year. And part of the value of this process is because this is not set in stone. And one reason I wanted to come today is because I don't know the specifics of the Land Preservation Fund in terms of what you have planned, what your projects are, both for 23 and 24. And so this gives us an opportunity to say, this is the draft. Is there anything that we need to do to tweak this or make any updates before the board does the approval? And so the plan at this point is that at the meeting this coming Tuesday, the board would have its public hearing, which is an opportunity for the public to provide any feedback on their budget. The meeting, so that's the 14th. So the meeting on the 21st is a meeting with the board of kind of a work session. So that's an opportunity for them to talk in more detail and more specific about all of the budgets, all the different funds, and then make any tweaks or changes that they want to make. And then the meeting on the 28th would be the meeting they actually adopt the budget and go into. And so the last two columns, the first column is the requested. And so I received this information from Sandy. So Sandy historically had been the one that compiles the budget.
I think Barry, you worked on these requested numbers, correct?
Yes.
With Sandy,
That's
yeah,
correct.
yeah. So that's a good point.
Yeah.
So Sandy, thank you. Sandy
Sure.
requested to the different department heads to provide her information. She then put it into the budget. She then handed it over to me. And then, so that's kind of the requested column. And then the recommended column is what we would be taking to the board as a recommendation for them to consider for their adoption. And so in this case, I lowered that amount because the ending fund balance, so if you look at the last, if you look at the requested column and you look at the last number of the page, that's negative $678,000. So the state of Michigan, in that P2, the act that I referred to before, also has a section that says that it is illegal to deficit budget, meaning that you are spending more money than you have in the bank, not in the bank, but in your reserves and your fund balance.
The deficit budget or the deficit spend?
You can't have a deficit budget, you can have deficit spending. Good clarification. So deficit spending simply means that, so let's say I have $1 million in the bank, And I put together a budget that uses $100,000 of that. So I go from $1 million in fund balance to $900,000. That's perfectly fine. But what you can't go to is from $1 million to negative $200,000, right? So, because that's not allowed as practice. And so what I did when I put together the budget is a couple things. One is I updated the revenue numbers. So you'll see the revenue numbers are a little bit stronger based upon potential projections related to property tax collection. And then, do you have a copy of that? Okay. And then I lowered the expenditures to ensure that you had money available. Now, your guys' fund is kind of unique, and that normally, if you look at like the general fund, your fund balance is really important because your fund balance is the amount of money that you have set aside for future unexpected events. So those could be the state of Michigan lowers revenue sharing, which is a major revenue source for the state, like they did back in 2007. If that revenue dries up, you need to have some money set aside so you can still operate, so you don't have to cut services. Or if all of a sudden you have a major expenditure that you didn't expect to have. So you want to have a healthy fund balance. Now your guys' fund is a little bit different in that you are using it to when opportunities present themselves, you're using that to acquire that additional property. And so having deficit spending is in itself not necessarily a bad thing. But I also, this is an assumption of my point, is that for next year, you may not know exactly what you're going to spend your money on. And I may be wrong there. But I tried to still set enough money aside, especially in the land easement fund, because that seems to be your primary expenditure item, so that if opportunities do present themselves, you've already have a budget approved by the board that has enough money in it that you can proceed and not have to come back to the board for those approvals. So that's a lot of information. So I'll stop there, see if.
And I would assume, Barry, there must have been a reason why you thought we had the 2.2 million, right? I mean, somehow something went off, Rod, because Rod, there's no way that Barry or Sandy would have requested something that resulted in the negative 680,000.
It's all about our federal money.
Yeah.
Well, that's a factor, but what haven't seen is when we purchased the easements on the Andrus properties that paid off the mortgages, I don't see that money coming back into the accounts. And that's why I think we're over budget on all these things.
So I see. So on the request. And so that's something after the meeting, maybe Rod and Barry can look at, but I'll tell you where that is. It was, so we had if you look at the balance sheet, it's going to be on your balance sheet, and not this year, but it would be on the balance sheet. And I'll send you guys a historical balance sheet for the last several years, because it never hit your revenue and expenditures. So your balance sheet, think of as like point in time, and your revenue and the expenditure is your budget to actual, like the fiscal year. And so when those notes were paid back, they went into the 242,000,002. That's pooled savings, pooled for the whole township, allocated to 242 in February of 2022. And when you raised that, Barry, because we relieved the note, and then those two transactions came in February 2022. Our books were audited ending March 31, 2022, showing all of that as well. So the cash came in and the cash went out within that 1 year.
Correct.
So because it came back in February of 2022. And so what changed is no longer did it say a 1.7 million note receivable.
Okay.
But what would be helpful with this, and I don't know if you've done this before, I have some suggested reports to kind of like go back historically and show that, because and Barry, could you describe how we came to have the 1.7 note for a minute?
So we bought a property in fee simple, a farm property, and held it for a while. And then sold it to a trust, subject to purchase agreements that they would sell conservation easements on those properties. And are you familiar with how those things work? We're buying the development rights in the property. So we sold it to them subject to those purchase agreements that they would sell the easements when we assembled the funding for that. And then we also acted as the bank so that we held mortgages and notes on the property as well. So if they didn't pay it back, we could foreclose and take the property back. We assembled the money for the conservation easements. We paid them for the easements. It was funding from us and the federal government and the Ann Arbor Greenbelt program. So we paid them for the conservation easements. They turned around then and used those proceeds to pay off the mortgages on the property. So they now own the property free and clear, subject to the conservation easements and the development of the property, use of the property. And so in that final transaction, we put in $530,000 more or less. And along with money from the feds and from the city, and that all rolled that back to us. And so in the end, there should have been about a $1.2 million amount that funneled back into this account. And that's, I think that I certainly, and probably everybody else here, was assuming that that would go into one of these accounts, there would be no overage.
And it went into the pooled savings in February of 2022, okay? And so that's why the balance sheet changed. But I honestly think we need to look at like the month by month, maybe February, March. I don't know what you would suggest to kind of.
Yeah, we might want to have Heather take a look at that, or maybe reach out to Plant. Because theoretically, like you said, when they did the audit at the end of 22, they should have completed the appropriate journal entries so that it would have been reflected in the fund balance. So we're showing at the end of 22, $1.7 million. So theoretically, if I'm understanding what you're saying, that should have already taken into account the receipt of those dollars.
Correct.
Yeah, and you're thinking it didn't.
I didn't see it showing up
Not
in
sure,
the
yeah.
documents.
Yeah, because there was
And then I'm
also a
seeing
lot of
deficit that
expenditures
I think
too.
would have been covered, we wouldn't be $400,000 in the red if those funds had come in and been allocated appropriately.
Right, so they were allocated, I can confirm they were allocated appropriately to the proper cash account. But I want to confirm it went to the proper fund, because I looked it up and I looked at it with Sandy and I was like, it's right there, it's right there.
Yeah.
But
And again, it was my understanding or assumption that we were gold, because we were receiving that money back again, so we would not be exceeding the budget.
well, okay.
And if it carried as a debt owed to us or accounts payable, would that still then be within our budget amount? So
I think you're jumping ahead there. I mean, I do want to note, these were all audited statements by Plant Moran. Everything we're talking about was audited and signed off on. So I'm not saying there wasn't a mistake. I'm just saying, let's not jump ahead to a remedy, because I do trust our auditors.
Yeah.
So in
Okay.
theory, the purpose of the financial audit is for an independent firm to come in and verify the accuracy of your financial statements. And so when you're done at the end of 22, and that was your last audit that you had, the number that you see as the ending fund balance is the amount of money that you have available. And it would reflect any money that it was owed or should have came out, or, I mean, it is a good number.
Yeah.
And that is the number then that we use to build out future years. As Jessica said, is that should be right, and most likely is right. But it doesn't mean that sometimes there are mistakes that are made because the auditor doesn't audit every single number.
Right.
Right? They're looking at information, they're testing information. So there are times when mistakes are made and then you have to do prior period adjustments. But that would be something that would be normally figured out in that case for the 23 audit. So my recommendation would be for now is you have to rely on the numbers we have, build a budget around that. And then and our team is supposed to be helping with year-end adjustments, we could investigate that for, not me, because I'm not a CPA, but have that team to investigate that, verify that, because what they're gonna do is they're gonna provide that information, they being Manners team in assistance with the township to the auditors, and the auditors would audit. So there'd be basically kind of 3 checks. This is what the township has done, and our team helping review that, and then plant reviewing it a 3rd time.
Yeah, that'd be great. So we'll get on that right away tomorrow.
Are the records for this committee are kept in BSNA, correct?
Yeah, all of the township's financial information is.
Who updates them? Will and Barry? Or like who updates BSNA on behalf of our committee? Like who keeps these records?
I don't touch it.
So it's an assortment. So all the receipting is done by the treasurer. All of the accounting is done right by Rebecca. I enter any budget amendments.
Okay.
That's it.
Okay. So if we think that something's amiss, we need to let you know?
You've let me
not
know.
Or
You've let me know. I've looked at it. It's there. It appears to be correct. But we're gonna look at it again with Manor Casterison. It's not only appears to be correct, but it's been audited, but we're gonna look at it again.
but audited might mean that the auditor didn't specifically do a deep dive into this.
As they don't on anything, right? It's just of the financial statements as we present to them.
Okay, thanks.
Barry, how are you feeling about your understanding of where we went amiss and
coming
what we have to do in the
along.
future?
There was a comment about exceeding the revenues, if I understood correctly,
Audit the finding?
Yeah, the revenue and expenditure is one and the same as budget to actual.
Yeah, so when you look at the general fund, the way that you budget is by each department. So you want to make sure that the clerk's department, the manager's department, you have to make sure that the totality of the individual line items are not over budget. So in other words, you can go over supplies, that's perfectly fine. As long as your other line items are less, the total at the bottom. In this fund, we don't have a department, so it's the entire fund.
Yeah.
Right? And the only ones that are really important to make sure you don't go over is the expenditure side. Because if you take in more revenue than you expected, well, that's great, right? That's no big deal. It's the opposite if when you spend more money than you had appropriated.
Yeah,
So,
understood. So you're looking at total expenditures. This is the revenue and expenditure report.
Yep.
For 3/31/23. You're looking at total revenues of 665 and expenditures of $1,645,000.
Mm-hmm.
And calling the $1 million difference as
Dipping into your fund balance.
And so the total revenues appear to me to be just the property taxes and related items on the north side of the revenue, like on this sheet here, but don't reflect that there is a previous year's fund balance. That is, we haven't spent every last dime that we had previously. And so it seems to me the revenues, the available funds is the revenues from any one carry forward, and then the carry forward from what was there previously. And if that's the case, then I don't see there being a deficit either.
So start with the column that says 21-22 actual. Okay, and go all the way to the bottom of that one, and you see there's $1,705,000.
Balance.
Yeah. You got that one?
Yeah.
So that is your savings account in essence, right? So that is the amount of money that you have from that at the end of that year, including all previous years that you guys have spent.
Right.
And so that's 1.7. And then if we go to the 22-23 projected column, because that's what we're projecting you're gonna spend, you see the net revenues minus expenditures show using $819,000. Your beginning fund balance is that same $1,705,000 because that carried forward. And so now your ending fund balance goes down to $885,000. And then if you go to the 23-24 recommended, we see the same thing where, again, you're budgeting for, again, it doesn't mean you're gonna spend this, right? Because it's gonna be what you determine to do, but your estimate is spending $716,000. And that takes away from now our new beginning fund balance of the $885, which leaves you with $169,000. So you're correct, every year builds on the previous year, which is why when we do the 24 budget, we have to project the 23 budget so that we can kind of figure out where you might end up at the 24.
Sure, so what you're saying is that we're constrained in the recommended budget for the coming year, we're constrained by the deficit that was shown to have happened, but that deficit doesn't include the funds that we thought would come back in.
Correct.
From the transaction with South Church Road.
Yeah, correct.
Might, it's all did.
Might, again,
It might, right, I realize it's part of the audit, it's part of
sure, it's been audited,
checking through it.
sure.
But it should be there.
So just for reference sake, what we've always done in the budgeting process is look at what we have available to us, what we expect the millage to generate over the course of that year. We look at the history of each of these different line items. My time, Carlisle Wortman's time, legal, all these other things. Not and land and easement acquisition costs, which for us is appraisals of property, surveys of property, environmental assessments of property. And so we look at those items and say, okay, so what's left over at that point, and put everything else into the land and easement acquisition line. And we padded those figures by a little bit so we don't go over. But again, based on if it's 30,000 in the previous 5 years, we don't put it at 100,000. Just say
Nothing about
30,000,
that is wrong. I
35,000.
think that's a perfectly appropriate way to estimate a budget. Yeah. It's not, I think, what I want to say about is we're kind of talking about two, I've heard people maybe confuse two different uses of the term deficit.
Is it confusing?
So the audit finding just simply found that the board did not budget enough money and spent more than we budgeted from 242. Okay, that's fine. It's not a big deal. That's the easy fix. I need a number and a day, run it through marker me. That won't happen again. Boom. The other issue you're talking about is your fund balance, okay? And your fund balance and what's there. And so I heard you say about the deficit you're constrained by. What you're constrained by, it's okay to spend down your fund balance, right? You've got a big purchase coming up. You want to go for it. And it's actually okay, I think, to have a fund balance of $170,000 in a fund like this. Not for fire, not for general, not for other funds, but for a fund dedicated where you may plan for a year or two and save up to go for a particular project. So I just want to note that it's okay for your fund balance to go up and down. It's never okay for your fund balance to go below zero.
And so, because with what you just said, Barry, is kind of what I tried to do as well, which is, okay, they were showing spending 1.5, that puts them into a deficit. We can't do that. So the only number I guess I did lower the legal a little bit, but the primary number that I wanted to reflect was that land easement. So trying to put as much money into that one, but still keep you in the black. Now, we can change any of these numbers on that requested column that you guys want to change. And then I would make the appropriate change to the recommended column that if you want to make any adjustments, we still have plenty of time to do that. And I think that was part of the value of me coming here, is to make sure that you understood kind of what the process the township is following and make sure that we got the appropriate feedback so that we could make the appropriate ultimate recommendation to the board. And then ultimately it's the board's decision to do what they want to do. They could take the recommended, or they could say, no, we don't want to do this for this particular reason, or they could say we want to do more, but it's ultimately obviously their prerogative.
One of the things that appeared in the report that was provided that we were over budget on was the land and easement acquisition cost, which included having to pay property taxes on a couple of properties that we purchased.
Mhm.
That was not an anticipated cost on my part, and I take responsibility for that. And my suggestion was that we should have a separate budget item for that. That doesn't happen frequently. It's only happened a handful of times probably in 20 years. But rather than lumping that into the land and easement acquisition cost, my suggestion is that we have a separate line item for having to pay property taxes. And we put X dollars into that, 30 grand or whatever it was, 20 grand.
Well, particularly because we have a new process, which is by reserve and sell. And so we
Yes.
plan with this new process, it's possible that we will own property for a while.
For some period of time, that's correct. And we will be subject to property taxes as a result of that, because it's not one that we're gonna keep
Right,
and make it accessible to the public such that it would be exempt from property taxes.
and I would welcome, I'm happy to do that and welcome any other requests for new account numbers. We're not gonna implement them until after April 1st. But definitely those, because I know some of these account numbers, we've gotten used to them, but they don't quite all make sense to us.
The other question I have is this is line number 955.
Yeah.
The cost allocation
Mhm.
for 38 grand, which in previous years has been substantially smaller.
Sure.
Could you explain what that is?
Yes. So the cost allocation plan, and there was I gave the board a 4-page memo on it, brought the one copy of these if you want them. The cost allocation plan is something that the board, that the township had not formalized until fiscal year 21-22. So costs from the general fund, and I don't know, what are they at this year? Recoverable costs roughly from the general fund.
For the total general fund?
Yeah.
So,
So people understand the scale of what we're talking about.
700,000.
Okay, so let's say roughly 700,000 of costs coming from the general fund to support the indirect activities of parks, open space, water, sewer, fire, all these other funds. So prior to having a formalized plan based on data, what was done was there was kind of a informed guess. And frankly, it was hitting our water and sewer funds, our enterprise funds too hard, unfairly, and that is a no-no, of course, and also our fire funds. And so we worked with Woodhill, went with some of the data, and you're happy to dig into the details of this as much as you want, but for example, what it's based on is the costs that are allocated are very minimal. So it's the cost of the accounting staff, the cost of the audit, the cost of IT, and then to some funds, the cost of the treasurer and the cost of buildings and grounds. So are any costs of buildings and grounds allocated to open space? No. Are any costs of technology allocated to open space? No. You guys don't use space here. You don't have computers. No. Are any costs of the treasurer allocated to open space? No. Because you're a millage fund, there's a 1% admin fee that's placed on it that should cover their costs. So the only costs that are allocated to the open space fund based on data apportioned are the finance staff and the audit.
And so in previous years, the audit cost has been quite small.
In previous years, open space was not paying for what I would say would have been a fair share of the audit costs.
Okay.
I think it was $225. Yeah.
And then zero.
What's that?
It's $225 back in 21, 22. And then there's zero on that line.
So I think in 2021, your cost allocation was around 5,000 or 6,000 for open space. In 21, 22, there was a last minute board revolt on it. And they took it out of open space and out of parks and put in $225 into each of those. And Rod, do you want to talk a little bit? And so I shared, we have a budget professional coming in. We're looking at, cost allocation plans, cost recovery, however you talk about it. It is a common accepted practice. We've done it professionally based on data. I think it's completely justifiable and appropriate. I handed it over to Rod and Mark and said, consider this or not.
Yeah, so the idea with cost allocation is that any individual fund should reflect the cost to run that fund.
Mm-hmm.
And in most governments, the majority of your operational expenses are housed in the general fund. And so if you look at for example, the water fund or the sewer fund, you have staff that are sending out bills, collecting bills, you're doing all kinds of, you're managing investments, all of those types of things are handled. And so the ratepayers, an example of the water and sewer system, should be paying for a share of their costs associated with that. And you do that with any fund that you would have, not just those potential funds. Now, the challenge with rate studies is that this is an art, not a science, right? There is no exact methodology to say it costs exactly within 32 cents of this to be able to charge a particular fund. So what you want to do is have a methodology so that you can justify that you're using a system, you're using metrics to make a determination of what that fund is being charged, so you can justify it. Now, as Jessica said, what the township used to do is what a lot of local governments have done, which is, we throw it up on the dartboard, that's the number we charge, and every single year we're just gonna roll it up by 3%. Mm-hmm. And that is not the best practice, obviously. Right. So what the township is trying to do is to come up with some methodology, and it may not be perfect, but at least they're trying to use some methodology that's based upon real numbers. In this case, they're looking at things such as the number of cash disbursements, some of the other.
Yeah.
If you want to talk about the specific ones.
Sure. Just as an example, the indirect costs that hit open space, we look at calendar year end of the dollars spent. We base 25% of the finance director's costs on dollars spent, apportioned across all the funds, including, the DDA, 75% based on the number of employees, the finance manager and finance assistant, 20% based on cash disbursements, 10% based on employees, 70% based on dollars spent, and the audit costs, which is the size of the fund balance, proportionate against funds. And I'll leave this memo and these spreadsheets here if you want to see how the spread is. I will say, something like the fire fund is going to be closer to $90,000 or $100,000.
Well, all right, I understand you're trying to justify it, but look at the size of that assessment. And suddenly, I understand you've said this is not science, this is an art. And shouldn't it be subject to some kind of negotiation as to how much suddenly is thrown into our budget?
So I think that's the reason why it went up so much. It's the projected budget. So what we did in 21, 22, and I would recommend we do is we bring it to the actuals. So the cost that went up is in the cost of, we want to hire a finance director. We're planning on, some continued financial consultancy. It's that overall cost. And we've had to, our last audit costs were, closer to 90,000 instead of 60,000. Hopefully we'll be back down to 60,000. So the issue is, because that's really the only costs that are impacting open space. So it's really the budgeted cost for finance has gone up a lot. That doesn't mean that the actual cost allocation for each, if we say don't hire a finance director, the cost would stay down. But realistically, to be the kind of functioning, high-performing township we want to be, we have to pay for accounting staff.
I'm still not really that comfortable with this, especially in light of what people voted for with the millage. I think some people might be quite surprised to find out how much of this millage is leaking into expenditures that are very marginal in terms of what this commission is supposed to be
Well,
accomplishing.
it is, in all fairness, Will, it is directly related to, like, literally the number of cash disbursements for LPC, literally, number of employees, 0, right? I mean, some of your numbers are so small here. You had 51 cash disbursements in the last year. I mean, that's almost nothing, right?
Well, you're saying it's almost nothing, but when I look at it as a figure projected at $38,000, I mean, if you think of that's possibly 8 or 9 acres of recreational land that we could purchase with that amount of money.
You want to talk about the accounting budget, where you think we're at with that?
Is a cap required by law, or is a cap required because it's a best practice?
It is a best
Best
practice. It's not required by law. But the principle is that you should be reflecting in any individual budget the true cost of running that department. And from a percentage standpoint, if I may, because I just want to answer kind of your question, is that it's 5% is where we're at now based upon the number. And as Jessica said, that number likely will come down because these are budgeted numbers for next year. So theoretically, it'll be less than 5%.
Right.
So from an outside, and I understand your concern, it's a completely valid concern because, like you said, your goal is to preserve property, and now all of a sudden you have less money to do that.
Right.
But I would also say that if you look at, again, state law in other aspects, such as special assessments and other types of things, to allocate 5% for administrative costs is generally allowed in many different situations. Sometimes it's even more than 5%. It can go up to 10%. In most cases, up to 10%.
Even without justification.
Even without justification. So a lot of times you just say, I'm taking 10% administrative costs, and there's no methodology behind it.
So you're confident that the methodology that we've done, it was within the norm, either of Michigan Townships Association or the whatever, it's solid? We're on good footing?
I think you're on good footing, and I say that because, again, you utilize the Woodhill Group, which is an expert in this field. Okay. So they do this across the state of Michigan. I've never worked with them myself, but I know their name, I know their reputation. And again, I just reviewed the logic, if you will, from a third-party perspective of what was established, and it makes sense to me. There's nothing that ran like there's something over excessive or something that was completely unfair from just a third-party independent perspective.
So I know we're in the formation process of our budget and it's subject to change, but the 242 open space preservation budget page on the Scio's website has 26,464, which I thought was sticker shock. And then the one presented today is 37,928. I guess we should lock it in before next week. It goes.
No. These numbers are changing across the board.
Yeah. So
everything's changing.
Normally, when you look at a budget process, we would be doing this over 6 months, right? And you'd have a lot of time to refine the numbers and get information before you put it on the township's website. Okay. The problem that we're having in this situation is that we're condensed. I was brought on board 3 weeks ago. Mm-hmm. And so I've done 3 weeks of work. I've done 6 months of work in 3 weeks. Mm-hmm. So that means that, for example, in this number did change because, as Jessica mentioned, there are a number of most of the budget is impacted by salaries and wages, and that was the last piece that I was working to solidify to be able to present to the board. So that's why you see a change there, is that we're working, it's a revolving update process. Now, at this point, I don't wanna hold my feet to the fire, but most everything should be set and resolved. There should not be any significant change. I can't promise you that, but at least at this point, I think we're pretty good.
And I would ask one thing, if you could attach an addendum to whatever the budget that kind of talks about the cap, how it's formulated, so people kind of know what it is, how it's derived and how it's allocated.
You said 5%, but it's actually more than 5%, isn't it?
It's not set by a percentage. He was just giving you what it.
I just took the 37,000 divided by the 710.
Here, I'll leave this 4-page memo, include spreadsheets.
Okay.
No,
Can I just ask
please.
just a process question, since this is my first LPC meeting and quite
This is
honestly.
unusual.
But so typically, what is the role of a commission, this one? In terms of like, how do we connect into the overall budget process? What do we have responsibility for? And then to your question, Will, like, is there a negotiation, or you all sort of tell us what we have?
I mean, formally, the commission has no budget authority or responsibility at all. I mean, that's the wah-wah answer, right? But I mean, obviously, the board wants the commission's recommendations. Typically, Barry comes up with the recommendation. And frankly, your budget's pretty straightforward, right? You know how much is coming in, you know how much you've got to work with. You all are doing the multi-year planning with it. And something I would just say, as residents and taxpayers, the deficit in the general fund that has been growing year over year, and some people are talking about increasing millages to fill it and things like that. It's really been driven, I think, by two things, and Rod, the expert, can correct me on any of this, but one, lack of cost recovery of indirect costs from some of the additional activities that voters have authorized. And I would say indirect does not mean illegitimate. They're legitimate, but indirect costs. And two, our planning and zoning fees. We have been bleeding money in planning and zoning year over year. And I don't know, there may be some other ones.
Yeah, I mean, you guys are somewhat unique in that you have a lot of different funds that do a lot of different functions, right? So you have a separate fire fund, you have a separate parks fund, you have the separate land preservation fund.
We've got 11 SAD funds.
Yeah, and yeah, so roads is a good example. Is that, like, I used to be a township manager, and all of the roads activities was handled within the general fund. And so you guys are somewhat unique in that, and then you divide everything out into smaller buckets. But I don't know the specific history of this committee, so I could be completely wrong. But to your question, which is, what is the committee's role like this? I would say normally, and I could be completely wrong here, is that townships establish independent committees as advisory to the board, so that you have individuals that are experts or interested in a particular topic area. They are able to provide information and guidance to the board that then ultimately drives the board's ultimate decision. Because at the end of the day, as Jessica said, I assume that you have no statutory authority. Now that can be different for things like DDAs and some other types of things, but in this case, you guys have no statutory authority, I assume. That's good.
And that was my understanding mostly, but I got lost in this conversation about like.
Over appropriations is just with the board.
Thank you.
But, I'm sure, Jessica, I'm sure everyone here will agree, we do have a fiduciary responsibility for the funds that we recommend for various purchases, right? I mean, so that's the reason I think we need to look carefully at how our funds are being allocated, independent of our review and our purview and our ability to have some judgment about how those funds are being spent.
Absolutely, and the cost allocation plan is part of the proposed budget. So, I mean, there's nothing set in stone, okay? I did put together kind of background for the board at our last meeting on how we used to do the allocation plan, the evolving methodology, so you can see it. And I would also recommend, and I don't know, John, Barry, me, Mark, somehow, just kind of regularly checking in, maybe even quarterly, on kind of your balance sheet and your revenue to expenditure, just to make sure that we affirm that we're all on the same page, working with the same numbers, so we don't have, surprises, Barry, like with the question about the 1.7.
So for cost allocation best practices, are we following, I see this GFOA, they
Yep.
have, are we following what they recommend?
Yep. Yeah, we worked with the GFOA template and models, as well as whatever the other organization is as well. So yeah, this is very standard. And like I said, I mean, some places, and I don't know how the city of Ann Arbor does it or the county did it, John, but I know a lot of places, will just put that X% on and not be able to justify it with any data. And so I have to say, the cost allocation methodology that we're using, it is very few indirect costs. And it's a pretty, I think others could argue that, and I wouldn't support it, but I think others could argue that open space, they might charge for, part of the buildings and grounds or stuff like that I don't think is reasonable. So I think we're being pretty conservative.
So we pay not based on the size of our budget and the size of our millage collectibles. We pay based on the part of the overhead that we bear, that we.
Correct.
The encumbrance that we are.
And all I'm saying is, and exactly what it is finance staff and audit as a portion across our 15 funds, based on looking at the dollars spent, number of employees, number of cash disbursements, for the prior calendar year. Literally data points on every single one of those spread across. So it's not that that's the only way to do it, it's the best way to do it, but it's legit and it's sound.
Well, if we're paying about 5% of those costs, I mean, we're not paying it, but if we're allocated that amount of expense, then if we save $30,000 on the audit this coming year, which you think we might do? Right?
Yes, I sure hope so. Yeah.
And that's only gonna go down $1,500. $38,000.
That is correct.
6.5.
Ish, yeah.
And you were mentioning, I'm sorry.
Rod.
Yeah. Rod.
Yes.
You mentioned metrics. Is this based on some metrics that you've been able to figure out and pinpoint?
Yeah, so that's what kind of Jessica's referring to is that each individual fund has a reflection of those individual metrics. And so, you look at yours, we're talking about $38,000, but if you look at the fire fund, it's about $200,000.
Maybe we should do like because I'm just noticing too, if people are really, I'm impressed, but like if people really want to know about cost allocation, like I do think.
Why not so high?
Yeah, I know, but for real, because I wonder if we shouldn't, as a board kind of have a separate session or something.
Or just, is it on the, like I say, if you can append it to the budget so we can.
So John, yeah, I gave you a 4-page memo on it 2 weeks ago. I am passing it around with all of the spreadsheets. If somebody wants to.
I've seen it, yes.
No, pass it around.
Jessica, did you say that also there's 1% comes off the top of the tax collection for a millage?
So that is separate. That's authorized by, MCL 211. For anything that any millages that the treasurer brings in, there's a 1% admin fee. You know how you see that on your tax bill?
So what is that money used for?
Well, that is about $500,000 goes into our general fund. And it is supposed to be used for the tax collection and perhaps some of the assessing function. We bring it in just as general revenue in our general fund because we've never had very sophisticated budgeting. And so that is why in the cost allocation plan, we didn't in our cost allocation plan include any of the costs of the treasurer's tax collection function in your cost allocation plan.
But that does come to over $60,000, right? How much does it come to? $6,000, $7,000. How much, do you know, 1% of?
$500,000 total for the general fund. It's to cover the costs of the tax collection and assessing by law.
So, yeah, The administration fee, the township has to collect the taxes for everybody else, right? So you collect the taxes for the school district. That's not a good example, I'll explain why, but for the state of Michigan, for the county, the library, and you eat the total cost of doing that, you know, right? As well as, this is the important thing that people forget about, the assessing side of the equation as well. And so to be able to determine how much money the library gets or the county gets, we have to have an assessment function. And so the cost of the admin fee is really intended to cover that total operation. So not just treasurer, but also the assessing, as well as a good example that I like to use is when there are tax tribunals. For example, with the jurisdiction I came from, we had a Meyer, and Myers came in and fought it. We assessed them at 15 million. They wanted $7 million. Well, we had to spend, I don't know, 15 grand for appraisal, right? And we ate 100% of that cost. The county, the state, nobody else helped offset that cost.
We just did that with Meyer last year.
Okay, so there we go. So that's the admin fee is really intended to cover that totality of those operational impacts. So.
All right, well, I don't think I'm making it tough on you. It's been really interesting to learn a lot more about how the township's finances work. So we really thank you for your time and diligence.
Yeah, and I would be really, I'm just mindful that we've taken more time than the 20 minutes John asked me to keep to.
Okay, well, maybe, I think we've suggested some further conversations that
Yeah,
might take place.
definitely. Yeah, so how about if Barry, Rod, and I, and John, I can keep anybody, we'll go back and get out the detailed report, make sure we can verify the journal entries. If there's any problems, we'll go through a review process. And then also if anybody wants to just pick up the phone, talk about any bit of the budget process, cost allocation, reach out to me or Rod.
So if LPC sells another piece of land and we think we've got incoming revenue, what do we need to do to make sure it's reflected?
It should be in the proposed budget of proposed budgeted revenue.
So there was just a disconnect in communicating or?
Yeah, well, that's part of why I wanted to come here.
I mean, would we have had this corrective action and had that money been in the right account?
Yes, you're still at that because that's only done on the expenditure side. So that finding is because you spent more money on an expenditure side, not because you had a deficit. So again, that's the.
But would we have spent more had the books reflected the Andres?
So I want to just let's get clear on the books because it seems like everybody here thinks that there's $1.7 million missing from the open space fund. So why don't we clear that up and then reconvene? Because I don't think it seems to keep coming back to that.
You're right.
And I'm just not certain that that's true. I mean, I don't know. I saw the journal entries. I see it going into your account, but I'll sit down and we'll look at it. So.
Yeah, I'll just add that Barry has kept cash in, cash out flow sheet forever, as long as it's been going on, and we've been looking at it regularly. I don't know, maybe
Yeah.
every other month we look at it.
And I know, and that's great for planning.
The only two issues here, except for the new cost allocation thing, but I understand that has to be done, and perhaps it's fair. Anyway, is the Andres money, which you're gonna clear up, it's gotta get, found and
Well, we don't know that it's lost. Let's be clear. It's been audited, it came in.
And, we don't have a balance sheet. We don't have assets and liabilities.
Yeah, there's one here.
You do.
No.
She did provide.
So what I want to say
It's not a
is,
balance sheet.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't have accounts receivable. We're looking at that. But there's two items. One is the Andres money. The other is the federal money coming in. Barry?
Yes, sir.
Saying this for your benefit too. The other is the federal money that we have coming in. Those are the two big pieces that throw these numbers into a different, much different light color.
yeah. And somehow, Barry, we got to work. I mean, I think using Barry's spreadsheet for planning and budgeting is great, but when it comes to the financial records, we all gotta be working from the same data, however we can do it. Okay?
Okay, we may need to revisit this briefly
Happy to.
individually.
Anytime,
So
anytime.
thank you all for coming.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
All right, if we can move on and, we're gonna have to move it along, it's gonna take a little longer than we expected. Let's think about reports of other commissions. Is there any report on planning that's significant for us to know about briefly?
We're gonna have, the environmental group reporting on Monday, and there's also going to be, Mandy from Pittsfield Township kind of presenting on how they redesigned Michigan Avenue with, what do we do about Jackson Avenue kind of thing. So it's gonna be visioning kind of thing, and that's this Monday, right in this very hall at these tables.
It's a public meeting?
Yes, absolutely. Public meeting, and people are encouraged to attend either in person or via Zoom to catch the presentations.
Thank you. All right, Parks, Pathways, and Preserves. Liz, did you attend the meeting?
I attended the meeting, it was yesterday. They have really beautifully merged these two groups. It was impressive, I thought. I think Anna Cohen has a lot of credit for that. And I'll just read through what their projects are, and if you have any questions, you can ask on each one. They talked about each of these: the Z Road Pathway, the Uplands Sidewalk Project, Marshall Park, Scio Township Hall Park, Sloan Preserve, Van Curler, West Scio, Liberty Pond, and Douglas David Marshall. So they went through each one of those, and in order, the Parks and Pathways and the TAP, it was very impressive. So they've got their finger on the whole business.
Cool. Good. Right, significant things from the Board of Trustees meeting, John?
Recording in progress. Recording stopped. Recording in progress.
So I just noticed that it was, I'd ask Kathleen and Rob, I see you're here. Can you hear us? I want to make sure of that.
Yes, I can hear fine.
Okay, I saw that the recording was stopped, but I didn't click on that, at least not knowingly. I wanted to make sure that you folks were still with us. Thank you for that information. Sorry.
So I've requested from you anything relevant from the Board of Trustees meeting we should know about.
Oh, yeah, budget. We're going to be talking about the budget. We just got a schooling in it, a lesson in it. So we're going to be talking about the first round of budget discussions, and then there'll be a public hearing, and then we might be able to do it on the 21st, frankly, if we have the 14th to talk about it and the 21st to talk about it.
Do you feel, John, your understanding of our little problem, our little contention is adequate to be able to enter into those negotiations?
I'm not sure that I really kind of understand it yet, because this was just, explained to me as well. It's going to take a little bit of assimilating it. What does it mean? How does it work? How does it impact? How does it impact other funds? The cost allocation. We obviously need to clear up, and Barry's going to be talking about it, I assume, the revenues that are due Scio Township from the feds, and when that's coming, how much it is, and what steps we are on that, so that we can let Rod know ASAP to reflect that in our carry forward or in our budget expressions.
Okay, thank you. And Sustainability Task Force, you have a big event coming up, right?
On the 14th, I think they're going to make a presentation to the board. And they are pulling together all kinds of things, and our little group has submitted, and that will just be incorporated into the rest.
Made a report and trying to project some costs for John, trying to project. Sorry. The sustainability group is trying to project some cost into the budget for the coming year.
That will be hard.
We might want to add something for the cap.
Yep. And that's part of the report.
Right.
You'll see it.
Yeah.
Okay. we're gonna try to move along here. We'll look forward to more detailed report, maybe on that at our next meeting, okay?
Oh, yes, yes. I unfortunately couldn't attend the last one. I had COVID. So I stayed home and
Welcome
then.
back to the world then. All right, old business, nominally, creation of MI Farmland. You just passed something out.
Yeah, I passed that out. So the Michigan Farm Link is, Barry, you know about this, you were on the.
We talked about this and its formation and actually happened.
Yeah, this happened, the Washtenaw County Conservation District has taken it over. They've raised money along with some private people, in the county. Pitching in particularly Trilby McDonald. McDonald, who writes for the Observer, and she's been a farmer and she's been part of this effort for a long time, and several others, including myself. And it came to be, and there's a budget for it through, what's the amount, about $150,000 raised.
I don't know, actually a lot of money they raised.
Through 2024, there may need to be more money raised to keep going after that. But anyway, and at WCCD, there's a full-time person working on this. So it's good, it's a great thing. And I put the website is on there and I emailed it to everybody. So take a look at it. It's worth a look.
It is worth looking at.
The other thing, and I'll be quick about this too, I attended online an American Farmland Trust thing that it showed that taking a 103-acre piece of property and not letting it go to development by conserving it as we do and as part of a farm. So 103 acres, I'll read this really quick. Illinois Farm Under Ag Conservation easement potentially avoids 19,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents in its first 30 years, which is equivalent to avoiding over 100 rail cars worth of coal burned up. And those carbon emissions, and it also avoids, because it's not a development of houses, it avoids about 8 tons of non-greenhouse gas air pollutant emissions at the same time. At the same time, it avoids a lot of costs that come, and we've talked about this before, a township or a county is more expensive than the revenue raised from property taxes to operate that development than it is to, conserve land. There's a net gain in conserving land, cost-wise. So anyway, this is a really good effort that the American Farmland Trust made. I tried to give you a website for it, but the page doesn't come up for whatever reason anyway.
So in effect, it validates the kinds of things we're doing.
It does, yeah, super does. Which most people don't know about land conservation. They don't know that it actually costs less, that it avoids emissions on just a practical day-to-day side and sequesters carbon.
Good.
And one quick thing I'll say about the MI Farm Link is that I was asked to serve on the advisory committee and I've agreed to do that.
Oh, that's great.
Good. Good to hear that.
Say no to pretty much
And
everything.
are you on also then, Tim?
For what?
For MI Farm Link.
He's asked to be on the advisory.
Yeah,
committee.
Sam.
Are you also on the committee?
No,
No.
I'm not.
Sam asked me to do it and.
Well, then you'll be able to keep us up
I
to
will,
date.
yeah.
So it sort of fits with Bioprotect Cell in a way, doesn't it?
Exactly, yeah.
So we have Bioprotect Cell on here. Did you meet or not in the last month?
We did. We met, and what we did was streamline the procedures, I guess, for going through different applications. We had 7 really excellent proposals to look at. We wanted to make sure we could look at each one in depth and do it in an efficient way that would, use all of our time well and get us to the result we needed to get. We talked about, communications between the how to transmit questions to the farmers that submitted proposals and how to follow up on that with them. Just our purpose was just to streamline, I think. So our method of looking at these is just the same as it was the first time we did it. We go directly from the requirements of the request for proposal that's on the township website. So we go, that says the requirements, and we look at how closely those proposals follow that format and how well they speak to the elements that we're looking for in conservation and sustainability. So do you all want to add anything?
Good question. You said there are 7 applicants?
There were for the Reds property.
For the Reds
Oh, for the
property,
Reds
we had
property.
7 applicants, so,
Yeah.
it was a good number, and they were really, really well done, so we
Yes.
wanted to make sure.
So do you think we're approaching a point where we have a methodology to share for future properties that we might want to consider making available?
Well, the first step is to determine that a particular property is suitable for Protect Sell. And so that's where, and I think the Cohens expressed an interest in the Sykert property. That was not one that we had discussed for Protect Sell. That is, wild space. It's really wonderful natural habitat right now. And so we hadn't discussed that. And that would be the first step. And then if we determine that a property is best suited for Protect Sell, like a farming property, often, then we would post a request for proposals on the township website and invite anyone who's interested to submit a proposal for that property.
Right. In regard to the King Cohen proposal,
Yes.
I happened to run into Stephanie King the other night. Her kids are in the same school as my grandchildren, and they had a big production. And she saw me right away. And there had been some concern that maybe she was not happy or expressed some adverse sentiment regarding our decision. So I asked her, I said, do you have any bad feelings about the way you were treated? Oh, absolutely not. No, we understand, my husband and I are in business. We know things take a long time. We didn't really expect immediate action. And then she sent me another email saying, I'm sorry if I left any impression that I wasn't happy with the way I was treated. So I just wanted to make sure everyone understands that.
Good.
I mean, we were trying
I'm
to
glad,
figure
yeah.
out what we were doing, and they were, wouldn't call them victims, they were sort of willing subjects. So anyways, that's that. Now, Barry, we're finally to the half hour that you wanted.
Actually, we're not there yet. We're at the public part of my report.
Okay,
So we'll hit on a couple of things there.
Do we do public comments?
Yes.
Public was okay, yeah, we'll leave it on.
Yeah, okay, good. I just wanted to
Yep,
make sure.
right back at the beginning. Rob Pattinson asked a question.
Yep.
I answered. So speaking of the rents reimbursement, I've continued to prod Brian Thomas, who's the federal program coordinator. And there's still some logjam that he hasn't been able to resolve. And so a few days ago, I thought, well, it's time for our supervisor, Mr. Hathaway, to weigh in on this, since Will and I had previous interactions with Brian's boss, who's the state conservationist here in Michigan. And so I sent a proposed email to Will, which he utilized and embellished. Was very nicely written, not at all threatening, which was great. He did a terrific job of that. And got a response. Actually, I did not see a response from the state conservationist. His name is Gary Lee, but I did get an email from Brian Thomas saying, I don't know if Gary's responded to Will, but he's requested a meeting with our easement programs division, which he shows me here in the string of emails.
This is in the state or the feds?
I think it's just the state program. But Gary, the state con, had asked for a meeting with Brian and whoever else is involved, whoever constitutes the easement programs division. I think it's 3 people. And so Brian says there's a glitch in the software related to my error entering the trusts. This is the Wren's trusts as landowners at the beginning of the agreement, and it's reading the wrong years for eligibility. We were able to fix the adjusted gross income issue, which is the form that everybody needs to fill out, everybody that had an interest in the property. So it was all 9 of the heirs and all fill out these adjusted gross income forms to indicate that over a 3-year period of time, their individual incomes did not exceed $2.7 million. So, you know, typically I'm dealing with one person, maybe a couple, or maybe there's a couple of people, you know, that unrelated that have interest in the property, financial interest. Everybody has to submit it. Well, in this case, there were 9 people. So he says we were able to fix the adjusted gross income issue, but it's not reading the farm and tract eligibility correctly. And he thinks it's because the trusts no longer have ownership of the property. That's the current hangup. He asked me for a copy of the recorded deed to show that the property had been transferred. So we had a purchase agreement to buy the fee simple interest of the property after the easement had been conveyed. We assigned that interest to Mike Vestergaard, and then Mike Vestergaard bought the property from the Wren's estate, in essence. And so I got absolute title to provide us with a copy of the recorded deed from the Wren's estate to Vestergaard. So he said that was the current hangup. Without reading that correctly, I can't certify the payment in the system. The rest of it should be paperwork. And so he's been now provided with that deed, and they're going to have a meeting apparently of the easement programs division and try to figure out how the heck they're going to get this done. So I thought it was time to try a different stick to poke things along.
Well, it is curious that all this while they hadn't done the analysis to figure out this relatively simple problem on their end, right?
Yes. It started with an error that Brian entered into the database. Back when the application was submitted for federal funding. That was his error. And then of course he went on leave for a while, and that error then carries on a life of its own, in essence. And so it's like, how do we put the genie back in the bottle? The longer it goes,
the worse it gets, right? Because of
Correct.
dating and.
Yes, and then the years turn over, yada, yada, yada. So there's some progress on that, but we still don't have our money.
A bit like our accounting error.
Correct.
And when that money comes in, it will go back into the open space.
Yeah, well, better.
We're right. It's not gonna pay
Doesn't.
for the finance director.
Yeah.
It's more than our annual millage, right?
Yeah, $868,550. So that's where that stands. No further update on the Lake Erie RCPP. The Greenbelt folks are still trying to work out the details so we can actually access the funds that have technically been available to us for 18 months now. But I hope that will happen sometime soon. And then we actually have an application round. We've got at least 1 and probably 2 properties that we want to submit for those RCPP funds. But until the process has been established, then they're not accessible to us.
Which might be next year.
It might be next fiscal year.
Oh, next fiscal.
And so, everybody's got different fiscal years. Ours is, as you know, April 1 to March 31 here in the township. The federal fiscal year is October 1 to September 30th.
Oh, so they're talking about next
fiscal year.
Okay.
The discussion in the Zoom meeting I had with Greenbelt staff and other partners was that if we can't get it together sometime soon, then it might be difficult to get the funds allocated before the end of the federal fiscal year, September 30th. That's the problem that Brian Thomas had run into in recent years, where the application deadline for the annual ASAP program was February or March, and working through all of the things to get the funds allocated by September 30th was starting to be a problem. And so he backed up the last application round to November 30th, I think it was, to give him more time to be able to get it through that whole process. And we may be running into a similar kind of problem if we try to have an application round, so we're already in March, try to get funds allocated for it before September 30th. And so we may be looking at mirroring the ASAP deadline for this year, which has not been announced yet, but something around November 30th. So it's, it's another huge slog. In fact, Remy Long from the Greenbelt program was on the Zoom with us. And at one point he said, I almost regret having gone through this whole process because it's just such a pain in the butt. But it's $7.5 million that we have accessible to us as a group of partners that nobody else has access to. So I commend Remy and Rosie, his staff person, for slogging through the muck on this, and hopefully it'll come, to fruition sometime soon. Had an inquiry from Mike Vestergaard also, and I just want to hit this briefly today because I want to hit some stuff in closed session. It's not something that's pressing, but and I think I sent you all an article that was published recently about a meeting that happened in Webster Township a couple of weeks ago that had 100 people in attendance. Were you there? Tim was there.
Yeah.
Talking about the challenges that local meat producers have with getting their meat processed. And right now they're all driving an hour and a half or 2 hours to somewhere over near Grand Rapids, I think it is.
2.5.
Leaving the animals, driving back, going back again to pick up the processed meat and then driving. And so it's a huge amount of time and expenditure. And there's been an interest in trying to cite a meat processing facility somewhere in Southeast Michigan for some time now. There's a couple of folks that have been at the forefront of this for almost a decade now, as I understand. And they've kind of been stalemated with that. I ran into Mike Vestergaard at the Ann Arbor Farmers Market a couple of weeks ago, and he was at that meeting. He's running into this problem. He's driving his cattle to Grand Rapids. And he said, could that facility be sited on his easement property? And I said, that's a darn good question. So I looked at the easement and I thought, I don't see why the easement would prohibit that. But then I asked, because we have, as you know, 4 other funding partners for that: state, federal, county, Greenbelt. And I put it out to my colleagues at those programs and said, what do y'all, here's what the easement language says, what do y'all think about it? And also, including Brian Thomas. And so everybody, I think at this point, agreed that the easement language does not prohibit that kind of thing. Obviously, it has to be within the building envelope.
2 acres, right?
And which is 5 acres.
Oh, it's 5 acres.
But the easement allows for 2 acres because it's a 100-acre property, more or less. 2 acres of impervious surfaces. And if you have a structure, a building that has a roof and so forth, that's an impervious surface. So there can be no more than 2 acres of rooftops on the property, or concrete for that matter. So there's some limitation there, but apparently this is proposed to be a relatively small facility, not intended to be collecting or processing meat from 5 states or something like that. So anyway, I just wanted to bring that up for the time being as a potential inquiry. There'll be more coming out about that.
I'm meeting with Jessica on Tuesday next week and Doug Lewan about the township ordinances that may or may not prevent that from happening.
So there's two issues here. One is whether the easement or not permits it, and then the other one is whether or not zoning permits it.
The easement, you know more about it, but Mike Vestergaard would like to see it on his property, understandably. But the 2 people who've been working on this, Damien and his wife Rosemary, that might not work for them. Or we can talk about that later, but anyway, they arranged this meeting. They asked me to be part of it, so I will, and I'm pleased that Jessica is interested. And, in support of the idea of a slaughterhouse being located here in the township somewhere, at least exploring that. The 2 people I just talked about, they don't care whether it's in South.
When you say it like that, who wouldn't want it?
a slaughterhouse.
Yeah, I know, that's, you gotta work on your branding, yeah.
Right, an animal processing facility.
Yeah.
No,
There, that's much better.
I totally know about that, John. I mean, the public perception
No, I
of the
understand.
slaughterhouse is terrible.
Yeah.
But this
But they
would
are
actually
typically
be-
very clean, very compact, very ubiquitous. You drive by one and you'd think it was,
An accountant's office, yeah.
screws inside that thing or something like that.
And
Anyway,
also ones run by Vestergaard, I think would be much different than your large scale slaughter facility.
Correct.
So.
it's gotta be accessible to, all of the farmers in the local region.
Right, I know, but it would be, under his.
If it were there,
Yeah, if it were there,
Yeah.
right.
it might be.
Yeah. So just an FYI for the time being, there's no proposal or anything like that. It was just something that came up and I thought I would share it with everybody.
So as we no longer own the property, it's his. He has most of the responsibility for following through with the zoning, right?
Yeah,
And our concern is an opinion about whether the easement seems to permit it. I mean, we really don't have the power to determine yes or no. We just look at the easement and agree that it allows it.
or doesn't, correct. And that's
Well, don't
why,
we hold the easement?
yes,
Yeah, so we do. We have
Correct.
nay power.
yeah. And that's why we reached out to our funding partners to say, yeah, because I didn't want to just, bolt, blast ahead and say, oh, yeah, we can do this. I wanted to get their opinion on it also. And I think everybody recognizes this is a need in the community. We've been talking about for a long time. There's more and more local meat producers here. They're all running into the same problem.
Yeah.
Brings all the local farmers with land to sell to us just down the road, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's
It's
good
not
to,
only-
I think this is really good, getting involved with this, getting involved with helping local farmers.
Yeah, we're trying to build a local food
That's
system.
what we want to do, constituency.
That's
All agreed on that?
It's
a goal on the sustainability
It's in
climate
our,
action plan too,
yeah,
right?
we're fully members of our sustainability and we're looking at them.
So that's all for that, all on that for now. And there's no update on the Delhi Woods property. It's in his hands, so we'll see if that ever comes. So that's all for the open session.
All right, so
report.
need a motion to go into closed session.
Yeah, so
All right, seconded, all right.
Second, do we have a second?
I'll support.
Oh, Will. All right, and I'll do a roll call. Janine,
Here.
Marty,
Yeah.
Lisa,
Yes.
Tim,
yes.
John,
Yes.
Will, and
Yes.
Reisman is yes.
Okay, are you closing us off, John?
Hanging up on them.